A young mother was found dead inside the Pizza Hut where she worked the morning shift. Police quickly uncovered several suspicious clues, and before long, the case appeared to be solved. But what happened next drew national attention and sparked outrage across the country, because no one could have predicted the twists that followed. Nancy DePriest was born on March 4, 1968, in Texas. She had an older sister and a younger brother, but not long after he was born, their parents' marriage fell apart. Nancy's father was in the military and spent most of his time stationed at a base in Japan. At some point, her mother found out that he was seeing another woman there, but instead of filing for divorce, she moved to another town, leaving the children with their father. He took them to Japan with him, and Nancy spent the next several years living there. When she was 13, they returned to the United States, and Nancy decided that she wanted to reconnect with her mother. She moved in with her in a small Texas town where her grandparents also lived. Over the next few years, Nancy and her mother became very close. Nancy was also doing well at school, and because she wanted to help her mother financially, she began working different part-time jobs while she was still a teenager. While she was in high school, Nancy met a boy named Todd, and their relationship became serious very quickly. Before long, they were talking about getting married and starting a family, which made Nancy's mother uneasy. She wanted Nancy to finish college and find a good job before settling down, but Nancy was determined to stay with Todd no matter what. On the day she turned 18, Nancy and Todd ran away to another town, and a few months later, they got married. Todd then joined the military, and the couple moved to Austin where he was stationed. Sometime later, Nancy gave birth to their daughter, Sylvia. By 1988, Sylvia was just over a year old, and Nancy was 20. Todd was still serving at a base near their home, while Nancy had started working at Pizza Hut. She was hardworking, reliable, and took her job seriously, so it wasn't long before she was promoted to assistant manager. So, by the age of 20, Nancy had a loving husband, a young daughter, and a good job. Her mother had eventually accepted her decision to marry Todd, and the two of them had repaired their relationship, which meant a lot to Nancy. She had also gotten into softball, and she and Todd played whenever they had the chance. On Monday, October 24th, Nancy was scheduled to work the evening shift. However, she also had a softball game that night, so she asked management to move her to the morning shift instead. That day, Nancy woke up early and drove to work with her daughter. She and Todd had a routine they followed whenever they were both working early, since it was still too soon for Nancy to drop Sylvia off at the babysitter's house herself. Nancy would drive to the restaurant with Sylvia in her car, while Todd followed behind them on his motorcycle. Once they arrived, he would leave the motorcycle in the Pizza Hut parking lot, take the car, and drive Sylvia to the babysitter. He would then return to the restaurant, say goodbye to Nancy, and leave the car with her before heading to the military base on his motorcycle. That Monday was no different. They arrived at the Pizza Hut at around 7 in the morning, and a little less than an hour later, Todd returned after dropping Sylvia off. He knocked on the door, handed Nancy the car keys, then left for work. Even though Nancy arrived at the restaurant that early, it did not open to customers until 11, which was still 4 hours away. Until then, she was supposed to prepare the restaurant for the day and make the pizza dough, all while working there alone. At around 8:30 a.m., the district manager began calling Pizza Hut locations across the city. This was part of his usual routine, and it allowed him to make sure that every restaurant was being prepared for opening. But when he called Nancy's location, no one answered, which immediately seemed unusual. He tried calling several more times over the next hour, and when Nancy still failed to pick up, he decided to drive over and check on the restaurant himself. As soon as he approached the building, he noticed something strange. The employee entrance was standing open, even though staff members were required to keep every door locked while preparing the restaurant before opening. When he stepped inside, he found water covering the floor, but Nancy was nowhere in sight. He walked toward the kitchen and heard the dough mixer running, which told him that Nancy had arrived and started preparing for the day, but he had no idea where she had gone afterward. As he approached the restrooms, he realized that the water seemed to be coming from the men's room. He opened the door and was met with a horrifying sight. Nancy was lying beneath the sink, unclothed, with her hands tied behind her back. There was also a large amount of blood around her head. The manager immediately ran out of the restroom and called 911. When paramedics arrived and saw Nancy, they initially believed that she was already dead. To their surprise, however, she still had a faint pulse, so they rushed her to the hospital. While doctors fought to save her life, police began examining the crime scene. Based on Nancy's condition, it appeared that the attacker had forced her to remove her clothes, tied her hands with her own bra, and then shot her in the head. Her clothing was still lying on the restroom floor, and nearby, investigators found a single spent .22 caliber shell casing. They also discovered that someone had stuffed an apron into the sink drain and left the water running, causing the sink to overflow and flood the floor. In the dining area, crime scene technicians found a short strand of hair that they believed might have belonged to the attacker, so it was collected and sent to a lab for testing. Police also noted that the safe built into the floor had been emptied. Cash was normally left inside overnight, and one of the morning employees' first responsibilities was to remove the money and count it. This gave investigators a general idea of what might have happened. It appeared that someone had entered the restaurant intending to rob it, but had also decided to sexually assault Nancy before shooting her. The fact that Nancy had been found without her clothes led police to consider that possibility, although at that point they had no physical evidence confirming that a sexual assault had taken place. Restaurant robberies were fairly common in the area at the time. 4 other Pizza Hut locations nearby had recently been robbed, but no one had been injured in any of those cases. Those robberies had also happened late in the evening or at night, when restaurants were still open, but there were few, if any, customers inside. What happened at Nancy's restaurant was clearly different. After investigating every entrance, investigators found no signs of forced entry. Since employees were supposed to keep the doors locked until the restaurant opened, police were left with 2 main possibilities. Either Nancy knew the attacker and let him inside, or he had a master key that could open every Pizza Hut in the district. All assistant managers, including Nancy, had one of those keys, as did several higher-ranking employees, which meant the list of people with access was quite long. While police continued processing the restaurant, doctors were still trying to save Nancy, but the damage from the gunshot was too severe. She was placed in a medically induced coma, and doctors told Todd that there was no chance she would regain consciousness, so he would have to make the devastating decision to remove her from life support. Later that night, Nancy's loved ones came to the hospital to say their goodbyes, and after she passed away, the case officially became a murder investigation. As expected, medical examiners found a .22 caliber bullet lodged in Nancy's head, which had caused severe damage to her brain. There were no signs of a struggle anywhere on her body, suggesting that the attacker had caught her completely off guard and left her with no real chance to defend herself. The examination also confirmed that Nancy had been sexually assaulted, and the investigators were able to recover biological material left behind by her killer. The problem was that in the late 1980s, DNA testing was still in its early stages, so the tools available to investigators were extremely limited. The same issue applied to the short hair found in the dining area. Because it had no root attached, experts could not obtain a DNA profile from it, which meant they could only compare it with hair samples from possible suspects under a microscope. In other words, detectives were now searching for a killer with almost no useful evidence. Apart from the possibility that the limited DNA testing available at the time might eventually point them in the right direction. They first spoke with the manager who had found Nancy and quickly determined that he could not have been responsible. He had spent the entire morning in his office, where he had been making calls and speaking with employees at several different locations. Investigators also learned that at around 8:30 that morning, Nancy had called the company that supplied the restaurant. The district manager first tried to reach her at roughly the same time, but by then, she was no longer answering the phone. This narrowed the likely time of the attack to around 8:30 or shortly afterward. It also allowed detectives to quickly rule out Nancy's husband. Todd had already arrived at the military base before Nancy made her final phone call, which meant he could not physically have committed the crime. Over the next several days, detectives interviewed every employee who worked at Nancy's restaurant, but none of them raised any serious concerns. They all had alibis, and investigators found no reason to believe that any of them had been involved in the murder. Police then obtained a list of employees at other Pizza Hut locations across the city who had access to a master key and began looking into them one by one. The process moved slower because the department had limited resources, but on November 9th, just a few weeks after the murder, detectives received an intriguing tip. By that point, the restaurant had reopened, and management had hired a security guard who told the manager about something he had found suspicious. One evening, two young men pulled up outside the restaurant and sat in their car across from the building for some time, with the headlights still on. They eventually came inside, ordered some beer, and began raising their glasses and making toasts in Nancy's memory. The guard thought their behavior was strange, but things got even more suspicious when one of the men approached him and started asking questions. He wanted to know how long the restaurant had had a security guard, whether the police had any suspects or evidence, and what else was known about Nancy's murder. At one point, he asked whether it was true that Nancy's body had been found near the cash register, and he even suggested that there must have been two killers. The guard later learned that both men worked at another Pizza Hut location. One of them also said that he had been opening his own restaurant at the time Nancy was killed, which supposedly gave him an alibi. The entire encounter seemed suspicious enough that the guard reported it to the manager, who then contacted detectives. Investigators identified the two men as 22-year-old Christopher Ochoa and 18-year-old Richard Danziger. They worked at another Pizza Hut and shared an apartment, while Richard was also dating the manager of that restaurant, a woman named Donna. This meant that both men had access to a master key and would have been familiar with the routine followed by employees working the morning shift. But that was not the only thing detectives learned. After speaking with the manager of their restaurant, they discovered that Richard had been scheduled to open the location at 8 on the morning Nancy was murdered. But when the time came, no one was there. The manager called Richard's girlfriend, Donna, who said that he was at her house and had overslept. In the end, the manager had to go and open the restaurant himself, while Richard and Donna did not arrive until about 30 minutes later, sometime after 10 in the morning. Detectives first went to the apartment Richard shared with Christopher, but neither of them was there. So they headed to Donna's house and found Richard inside. The officers said they wanted to ask him a few questions and invited him down to the station, but his reaction immediately raised concerns. Richard said he had been expecting them and was surprised it had taken them so long to show up. He then pointed at Donna and said, "That's my alibi." According to Richard, he and Christopher had gone to Donna's house the night before and stayed there drinking until late. Richard spent the night with his girlfriend, but slept through his shift and only woke up after his manager called Donna. She confirmed Richard's story, but added that alcohol made her sleep very deeply, so if he had left the house early that morning, she might not have noticed. While listening to all of this, detectives spotted a contradiction. According to the security guard who had first reported the men's strange behavior, Richard had specifically claimed that he was opening his own restaurant at the time Nancy was murdered, which supposedly gave him an alibi. But now detectives knew that he had not arrived at work until several hours after the crime. Richard eventually agreed to go with them to the station, where he made several more interesting statements. When detectives asked what he knew about the murder, he mentioned a number of surprisingly specific details.